Hello and welcome to Lab 3, Earth-Sun Relationships. So again, this video is designed to really just walk you through this lab, to point out some tips, tricks, and easy ways to accomplish this in a timely manner. So again, this lab is about Earth-Sun relationships, and as we can see within the objectives, we'll learn how to describe the Earth's rotation, revolution, tilt, polarity, and even shape. We'll also be able to diagram the 7 special lines of latitude and explain the relationship to solstices and equinoxes. We'll be able to explain the relationship between the angle of incidence and radiation intensity. We'll also be able to identify vertical, oblique, and tangent rays from the sun, use an analemma, and we'll be able to analyze day length for different locations of the year. That being said, let's get going. So let's begin. So Earth-Sun relationships, Part A, the annual march of the seasons. So the first thing that we're going to learn about is the rotation. We know that the Earth rotates on its axis, and it rotates every 24 hours, which we consider to be one solar day. Now, if we can scroll down to figure 3.1, I think this best explains that. So figure 3.1 is showing how the Earth itself is tilted. It also, as we can see, is rotating within itself. One day takes 24 hours. And then we have a line that's been drawn here, see the little finger pointing at it, that's denoting the circle of illumination. We know that at all times, half the globe will be daylight and the other half will be darkness. That being said, we notice that that halfway point is not always going to be cut between the poles. So that being said, some hemispheres will experience during different times of year longer days, shorter nights, and others will receive shorter nights and longer days. So as we can see within its revolution, the revolution itself is the journey in which the Earth takes around the sun. So the rotation is just itself spinning throughout the course of a day. The revolution is its journey around the sun. We know that takes 365 and a quarter days. That's 4 of those quarter days make up that leap year. But what's important to note, especially as observed in figure 3.2, is that the Earth remains at its tilt as it goes all the way around the sun. So by doing so, we find, and we'll learn a little bit more about this later, that actually helps create uneven lengths of daylight and darkness, which essentially fuel our seasons, and in some places keeps them, equal all the time, where they don't really experience a fluctuation of daylight and darkness, that they have a pretty consistent weather and climate because of the tilt of the Earth itself. So as you observe through that, you'll learn a little bit more about the perihelion and the aphelion, when the sun and the moon distance is either greatest or the least amount of distance. So you'll learn some new key terms. Let's continue to page 3. We talk about tilt. We know that the Earth is tilted at 23.5 degrees. Within its plane of elliptic. You also learn about its polarity, that while the Earth's axis is currently pointing towards Polaris, known as the North Star, we can see that sometimes North Pole is oriented towards the sun and sometimes it's tilted farther away, which is kind of makes reference to what I said earlier about that change in length of daylight. Now, as we'll observe later, I'll kind of mention it now, 2 words that are really important when understanding seasons. For myself, I always talk about intensity and duration. How intense is the radiation being observed on the Earth's surface that's being, obviously given out from the sun? And duration, how long of daylight do we have? Do we have longer days or shorter nights or vice versa? We also will learn in part 5 about the shape. The Earth is an oblate spheroid, which is an awkwardly shaped circle. This means that the Earth's rays strike the Earth at different angles for each latitude. So the Earth is a round surface, and when the sun is shining against that surface, depending on the angle and the direction in which the light is hitting it, actually it affects the dispersion of that energy, and we'll talk more about that as well. So as we move forward, we can see this beautiful diagram here, figure 3.4, that shows the Earth. It's showing its tilt, it's showing the special lines of latitude that were learned in earlier labs, and it's showing this word, incidence. So what does that really mean? So we have either low or high angles of incidence, meaning that when you have a high angle of incidence, the sun's rays are perpendicular against the Earth's surface. So it's going to be the most intense. When you have low angles of incidence, you notice that this is the same size box, but look at how spread that is over that surface. It covers a huge area. So because of that, because there is an angle involved and it's not perpendicular, it's still the same amount of energy, but it's being spread over a larger surface, which technically actually decreases it. So we can see here's a great video through the California Academy of Sciences that explain the annual march of the seasons. It's a great 3-minute video. I highly suggest watching that. It also brings in some additional key terms. Again, we mentioned the circle of illumination, which is this line right here showing that circle that wraps around. Where is daylight versus darkness? So we can move forward. Again, we can learn more about, this is the same type of diagram that plane of the elliptic of the circle of illumination. Instead of looking at more of a globe, just looking at a very simple circular diagram kind of showing how that circle of illumination may not align perfectly within the north and south poles. Now, this next part, this Pinot Milankovitch cycles. So Milankovitch was a mathematician who really he did the math that's very challenging that we don't want to do. So what he did is he found that there are cycles, 3 in particular, that the Earth goes throughout the course of its journeys that can actually end up changing climate systems and patterns over time. We learned about that in that video. The Milankovitch cycles that you learn about are precession, there's tilt, and I won't ruin it all for you. It's on there, so make sure you watch that video, and then you get into the question 1. And these are questions based off of your location. So it says, what you have learned from the reading and your prior knowledge, as well as the Pinot annual march of the seasons, answer the questions below. Question 1, in which hemisphere do you live in? Question 2, on August the 16th, scroll down, what season are you experiencing? Part B, what is the day length like during that season, and so on and so forth. Then it has you observe based on where you're located on January 16th. What season are you experiencing? What type of length of daylight do you experience? These are all based off of your observations, so make sure you answer those questions. Moving on to question number 4, identify the 7 special parallels of Earth and their latitude. Write each special latitude along with its degree on the line of the diagram 3.6, which is right here. So you're essentially pulling that data from the earlier lab and as well as earlier in this lab, and you're plugging it into where it belongs. Question 5. It says figure 3.7, which is this great drawing down here. Label the approximate point in the elliptical revolution where the perihelion and the aphelion occur. Part B, using the terms listed below, label the correct equinoxes, the solstices that occur during this annual revolution on the top line, and the season for the northern hemisphere on the bottom line. So go ahead and fill out that diagram. What you're doing essentially is you're pulling all the information that we've learned and you're applying it to an image. And it's really important for us to learn about that. Also, things that you should look at while you're in here is, during those different seasons, look at the tilt of the Earth. We live in the northern hemisphere. Are we tilted towards the sun, or are we tilted away from the sun? Or are we considered equal with the sun? And I think that will help you kind of distinguish the differences between equinoxes, the solstice, and also looking further into just how our seasonal attributes function. It's kind of cool. And then continuing through questions 6 through 10, again, are applying your observed and interpreted elements of how we look at and deal with our seasons and length of daylight. Moving forward, we can see that as you've learned, the Earth's surface is curved. Therefore, the sun's rays strike the Earth at different angles depending on its latitude. So you're going to learn a little bit about VR, vertical rays, OR, which are known as oblique rays, and then TRs, which are tangent rays. Knowing what those are, you're going to then, for question 11, identify those different rays on that diagram 3.8. So as we move forward into the next page, question 12, referring to 3.8, study the position of the Earth in the relation to the Sun in order to answer the following questions. So all of question 12 relates to that diagram. I'll scroll up one more time so you can see it. it's asking, okay, based on this information, based on your observations of the tilt of the Earth and how the sun is oriented towards the Earth itself, all these elements, what seasons are we experiencing? And it's going to ask you specific questions about those specific lines of latitudes and essentially how the Earth is being, how the energy is being distributed upon the Earth. So then we'll learn more about the declination of the sun. This is a bigger piece. So the first thing that we'll learn about is the analemma. So here is a great video on using the analemma. Go ahead and scan that QR code or visit the hyperlink, which will take us into this next element. So it says using the analemma, which I'll show you in a moment, to determine the sun's declination on the following days of the year. Use a ruler or a piece of paper to align it nice and straight. So as I move to this next piece here, what we can observe is that it's a calendar. It's essentially a calendar that plots the equator, the special lines of latitude, the Tropic of Cancer and Capricorn, and denotes which latitude is receiving the most intense amount of radiation on that particular day. So you can pick a special day. As an example, maybe we pick, I don't know, August 10th. Well, by using a piece of paper, we're able to draw a line all the way across to see that, what latitude will be closer to 15 degrees north is going to have the most intense radiation on August the 10th. So you'll be able to complete that and wrap up this portion of the lab. So moving on to part B, the angle of incidence. So what is that? Well, it's about the angle in which the sun's rays strike the Earth. So observe this little diagram, this drawing right here. Here is the book and the light above it, the flashlight. The flashlights are the same size, but notice the angle is different in each one. When the angle is, perpendicular to the surface, notice how all that energy is focused into a small area. When the flashlight's at an angle, look at how much more surface area it covers and lights up. Well, this is a great diagram, but imagine that book is the Earth's surface, and imagine that flashlight is the sun, and it works the same way. So question 15 is going to have you reference that diagram and make some observations and to interpret it. As we move forward through the lab, we're going to be able to look at question 16, which still has you reference that previous diagram, for you to identify the latitude, the highest angle of incidence, and what latitude would have the lowest angle of incidence, which then brings us into table 3.1, which is the angles of incidence for special lines of latitude at the solstice and equinoxes. So what we're going to be able to do for these remaining questions here, question 17 and so on, is that you're going to refer to the table. And then it says, then below, draw a sun to represent the correct angle of incidence for each time of the year and for this particular one, at the equator. The sun location for March has already been drawn for you. So this is saying if you lived on the surface of the Earth, which we do, and during this certain time of year, if you lived at the equator, where would the sun be? So we would see that in March, the sun would be at 90 degrees. So there it is, latitude equator, 0 degrees, March would be at 90. So then you would do the same for June, September, and December, plotting this angle by drawing a little sun. As we move forward, question 18 is having you look at the Tropic of Cancer, 19 is the Arctic Circle, 20 is the North Pole, and you'll continue to work through those. Question 21 says to refer to your completed figures and then to make some observations and interpretations based on that. Now, as we continue to move through this portion of the lab part B, we can see apply what you've learned. Imagine, this is question 22, imagine that you want to install a solar panel at your latitude. At what angles would you orient the solar panel in order to maximize, on the amount of radiation that is received? So it gives you some hints, some trades, and kind of things to work through that, but it's really about, applying what you know to real life things. You can get a degree in solar voltaic technology, and people have to learn using these angles of the sun and how often you have them and whatnot, and what the best one is for you is how they decide where to install solar panels, because you don't want to spend all that money and never take advantage of those rays. It'd be pointless to do so. And that wraps up part B. Now moving into part C, calculating solar angle. A little more challenging, something that'll take you a little bit more time. So the solar altitude, otherwise known as SA, also known as the angle of the noon sun, represents the elevation of the noon sun in the sky. Another way of understanding this is to think of the SA as the point at which the sun is the highest in the sky at our noon. That arc distance, the AD, is the number of degrees of latitude between the latitude, UR, and determining the SA, or the solar altitude, for that declination of the sun. The equation to determine solar altitude is as follows. It's your solar altitude is equal to 90 minus your arc distance. So the following steps demonstrate how to calculate solar altitude at a particular location on a particular day. For example, we can use November 1st and that latitude of 33 degrees north in the following example. So using the analemma on the previous part B, determine the declination of the sun on that day, November 1st. We find that it is 14 degrees south. Step 2, we have to calculate the arc distance. So to calculate the arc distance between the declination of the sun and the latitude for which you are determining, in order to do this, take the latitude in question and add or subtract the declination of the sun. Remember to pay attention to the latitude's designated hemisphere, north or south. So see figure 15 for some additional help. So you're going to be able to solve those using those steps. Some beautiful drawings that give you examples. Again, wrapping up with step 3 to get your final answer. You want to move forward again. So now check out this diagram below, and it shows where the noon sun is in the sky on November 1st at 33 degrees north. So we're able to take all those steps and then draw it out, very similar to like we did in part B when looking at that declination. So that being said, here is a video, a guided practice calculating solar altitude video to provide some additional and supplemental help. Again, take a photo of that QR code or click the link, and it will be some really great resources to help. And then as you do so, we're going to solve a handful of these different questions on a particular date, a latitude, and you are to identify the declination of the sun, the arc distance, as well as the solar altitude. It's always important to show your work so that way we can tell where you made the mistake if one is made, and we can provide better feedback. So you'll work through that, and we'll move into part D, the daylight analysis. And this is probably one of my favorite parts of understanding Earth-Sun relationships, is just how does the amount of daylight change throughout the course of the year based on specific latitudes. So table 3.3 shows that the day length for various locations on the Earth on a selected day of year can change. So as we can see, the dates February 16th, May 16th, August 16th, and November 16th were all chosen at random. They're just random days throughout the course of the year and do not align with a solstice or an equinox. This is done specifically to just kind of give you some perspective on how the length of daylight changes. So apply what you've learned, add the day length information for the North Pole and South Pole, because as you can see, they're missing from this data. So we can see that for the North Pole and South Pole, there's some 4 boxes of each missing. Go ahead and try to figure out, based on your observations and interpretations, the length of daylight for February, May, August, and November. Once you fill that in, you're going to move forward to the remaining part of this lab where you're going to be looking at critical thinking skills, looking at the table, correlating it with the location, and trying to figure out something about it. As an example, question 26 starts off, having a specific location for 60 degree north, but no location for 60 degrees south. What would it be? How can you find it? Google can be your best friend. You will continue to work through this part of the lab, which really relates back to that table that you filled in earlier, and it begins to ask you some of these bigger questions, like how does length of daylight really affect our seasons? What about different locations of different latitudes? Why is the northern hemisphere experiencing summer, but the southern hemisphere experiences winter? And then during the equinoxes, everything's kind of the same. So it allows you to really apply those big picture contexts to this. So then as you wrap up on the last page, it says, using the data from your completed table, create a line graph on figure 3.17 that shows day length for each of the seasons for the South Pole: White Horse, Keto, Canberra. So create a key for your graph and be sure to use different colors for each of the 4 locations. So what you're doing is you're essentially plotting either a bar graph or a line graph, whichever is easiest for you. I prefer line graphs because I just feel like that's easier to draw. And so for, if maybe I picked blue to represent the South Pole, well, I would plot for February 16th, how many hours does the South Pole get on February 16th, and I put my little dot there, and then you continue to connect your dots across the graph. After you complete all 4 of those locations, again, 4 different colors. If you don't have 4 different colors of pen, then at least try to do different patterns like dashed or dots. You will then wrap up with question 30, which is the last part of this lab. So I know this was a little bit harder, it's a longer lab, but I think that once you kind of get your rhythm, it really works out well. Be sure to check out some of the guided practice videos and the supplemental videos that have been posted within the description of this video to help kind of work through this at a very effective and easy pace. I hope this was helpful. Be sure to comment below if you have any questions or ideas. Be sure to like, subscribe, and we'll see you on the next lab.